All this week, we've been visiting with members of the Channel 3 team who covered the attacks on our country on 9/11 20 years ago. So far, all of our interviews have been about New York and the devastation from the planes going into the World Trade Center. But today we're talking about what happened at the Pentagon. 20 years ago this week, Channel 3's Eric Parker was working at NBC. He was in Washington, D.C., and he was dispatched to cover the attacks on the Pentagon, and Eric Parker is joining me now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You were a young guy working, just doing whatever anyone sent you to do at that time.
Yeah, I had been an assignment desk assistant at NBC News in Washington at the network desk. I was 21, and I got promoted to be a field producer that summer before 9/11, and so I spent the whole summer covering people's vacations, and so as a young guy would do. And so on September 11th, I was covering the producer who covered the U.S. Senate. So I was in the NBC News office at the U.S. Capitol building working that shift that day. And I walked in at about 8:45 for my 9 o'clock shift. And the other producer who was working there was already watching the first plane that had hit on the Today Show on NBC. And we both sat there and watched as the second plane hit.
And as a young man at that point, did it click for you, even what this meant with the second plane, or did that take a little bit?
No, fortunately, the producer that I was working with was very experienced, probably 15 years older than me. And as soon as the second plane hit, he stood up and said, "This is terrorism." And he started to leave, and he went back in. And I'll always remember we had two-way walkie-talkies. I had never seen them used. They always were sat on a charger in that booth. He grabbed two, handed me one, and said, "Take this. Our cell phones aren't going to work for much longer." And he was dead on. And he just said, "You go here, I'm going to go here." And he barked orders, and we went, and it was chaos from there.
Do you remember feeling like, I want to cover this, I want to go, or any sense of fear at all walking into it?
No, I think it was just such a react to what's happening. I don't think we had time. I mean, I remember being outside the Capitol building when the first fighter planes came in over D.C. because they didn't know if there was, there was apparently the plane in Pennsylvania was maybe headed for where I was, the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But so fighter planes came in supersonic. I mean, sonic booms over the city, and everyone's looking up, and these fighter jets are flying in. It was intense, but at the same time, I think if I wasn't working, it might have been different. But it was just for a young producer, and I'm trying to pick out which members of Congress I should talk to, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Intelligence Committee, and I don't know. I was a kid, and I had a photographer, and we were running around, and shortly after that, someone said, "Look, there's smoke coming from over there," and that was the plane that had gone into the Pentagon from the Capitol. We could see it. And we could see the smoke rising off, looking towards Virginia. And we had, our NBC colleagues were over there working. Fortunately, none were injured. But, very quickly it became not just about covering an attack, but it was an attack on the city where we were working as well. And, I got to work, as I said, about 8:45 in the morning. I worked straight on through the next day. And by the time I left, there were tanks parked out in front of the Capitol building in the White House, like legit military tanks. And it was a totally different city.
Did you have the feeling, I know when we were in 9/11, we had so many just regular people coming up desperate for us to tell their story, to find their family member. Was it more of a military scene there, or did you have a lot of also those desperate people asking you to help them?
No, I think first of all, the death toll was quite a bit lower, and I think most of the people, because it was the military, were accounted for pretty quickly. So it wasn't the same with the "Have you seen me" posters. I think the bigger concern there was that Washington very much was going to be in an ongoing threat, and that there might be another attack. So I think the biggest thing that I remember is just everybody there was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Was there another attack? Was something else planned?
Did you notice, as the military or even the more experienced producers, thinking, all right, this is the Pentagon, but what building could be next? Was there something like that? It
was, so I worked at NBC in Washington, and the bureau chief at the time was Tim Russert, the late Tim Russert, who hosted Meet the Press, and he gave an order that no one, until further notice, no one was to be inside any government building, because he was worried, and it trickled down to us that we were not allowed back in the U.S. Capitol, which it turned in the police closed it anyway, but we couldn't go back to our office until he said so, because he was like, we think something else is going to happen. That's a sobering message to get.
Yeah.
And at one point, they sent myself and a photographer up by the U.S. Supreme Court, and our assignment was, for several hours, to have a camera, this is when we still used tapes instead of digital, have a camera continuously rolling on the Capitol because we think there might be an attack. And we just did it because we were told to. But think back on that. I mean, my assignment was to record the destruction of the US Capitol. That's crazy. And thank goodness it didn't happen. But, you know, we were just focused on make sure when one tape ended, I had the next one ready for the photographer. And we were there to record the destruction of the US Capitol. That's a crazy assignment. And then the rest of the day, it was just, you know, they had the members in a bunker, and then they came out on the steps and sang God Bless America, which was a famous moment with everybody on the steps of Congress. And I stood right there and watched it with my own eyes. I mean, a lot of crazy, crazy stuff happened in a very short time. And I think that's my biggest takeaway is just, wow, that was 24 hours. And wow, it was crazy.
Right. And it really was this generation's Pearl Harbor. And of course, when Pearl Harbor happened, we didn't have the ability to broadcast live in moments, but just to have this go around the world and search for information. And really a lot of us, you know, not knowing and not knowing what could happen next. And for you, I imagine, just kind of looking over your shoulder of what's the next order I'm going to get.
Well, one thing I tell a lot of people, you know, when I'm lucky enough to talk to journalism students, the intensity of covering a big story like that, people had said to me that the World Trade Center collapsed. But of course, we didn't have iPhones. I couldn't watch a video of it. We didn't have any way to see it. It was the evening of September 12th before I saw a video of it. And of course, oh, it collapsed. And then I saw it collapse. I mean, that's how intense that kind of news story is.
Right.
It was 36 hours after the attacks, and I saw it and went, oh, it collapsed.
Right.
But you're so focused on your assignment in D.C. and covering the Pentagon and covering Congress. It was a day and a half later before I saw the video and thought, wow, look at that. But that's how tunnel vision you can get covering an assignment.
Absolutely. And now, some 20 years later, a lot of life has happened. You're married, you have a son. What do you tell, if anything, to Jack about that time?
Well, I think it's an important thing for everybody to know about. I mean, you know, I was only 21 at the time. I grew up in an era where, you know, we weren't having air raid drills or hiding under our desks or anything like that, like maybe a previous generation had. And then all of a sudden, here was our country under attack. So, you know, and I think there's a legitimate case to be made that those people who took down that plane in Pennsylvania, that was a plane supposedly headed for the Capitol where I was working that day. So, I mean, it's a real connection to me. So I've talked to Jack about it, and I think it's, you know, everybody says never forget, but I think there's lessons from it that we need to remember, you know, beyond just the victims and the brave people who, you know, gave their lives. There's lessons from it, and that it could happen, and that we need to be vigilant, and, you know, that we're part of a bigger world, and that there's things out there.
Right, especially as it's an ominous synchronicity as we look at Afghanistan 20 years later, and probably difficult for children to understand. But as we approach that day, is there anything that you typically do to mark 9/11 or will do?
No, I think about it a lot. I remember, the biggest thing I remember is standing out there and thinking how blue the sky was.
Yes.
It was just the blue. I was standing outside the Capitol building. This was all happening. And the one clear memory I have was just thinking, wow, it is like a perfect, clear day, and how blue the sky was that day. And that was before we knew, you know, the devastating loss of life. Obviously, we knew there was an attack, but early on in that day, and I just think about it. I mean, I used to walk into the Capitol and think I was the luckiest guy in the world, that I was 21 and this is where I was sent to work.
Yes.
And how beautiful. I walk in from Union Station to the Capitol building. It was cool. And I think about that blue sky that day, and just, you know, how it was such a terrible day on a Tuesday.
Yes, and people just not knowing.
Right.
That, and I know that feeling. I was an intern at the White House. I'm thinking, you're lucky. You're at the power seat of the world.
Amazing,
and just feeling like what you were doing, even at a low level, was so important because you were there. But not when I think all of us can take away that, right? That those people got up, they brushed their teeth, they went to work, had no idea how their life was going to change.
No, and even people who didn't have a direct impact. I mean, I think all of our lives changed a little bit. And you think about it, you know, just focusing on it as a journalist, in real time, I was confident that at 21 years old, I was covering the biggest story of my career. And that's kind of bizarre.
Right.
But it was that big. It was that big in real time that I was thinking, this is probably as big as it's going to get.
You almost hope it doesn't get bigger.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
Eric Parker, thank you so much for sharing your memories, your reflections.
Thank you.